Well, good morning. This is the Patriot Radio News Hour. Joe has been on vacation all week. I've not been really on vacation, but I've taken time off on the radio to try to get other things accomplished. It's summer, and the radio station's got a lot of people trying to take some days, and well, gold and silver's in the days that Joe has not been here and I have not been on the air. I'm going to check the gold and silver markets for you. Just getting up and running here on this Thursday. I'll take a look at the markets. Let's refresh this screen here. Markets have been everything's been pretty sideways this week. Markets up. The NASDAQ is having a monster day at the moment. So I guess Elon Musk must have sneezed or something, so everybody's going to buy a bunch of tech stocks. Gold is up currently about $31, just under $4,100, $4,097. Silver's up 67 cents today. It's been doing this thing for weeks now, going down into the upper 50s, trying to push back to 60, then back down to the upper 50s. But silver is today at $58.32. I am going to maybe get a $20 gold piece special here in the next couple of segments. I'm going to look that up, find a good price. But the number to call to buy gold and silver from the Patriot Trading Group, 800-951-0592. That number again is 800-951-0592. One of the things I do over the years when Joe takes time off, and I'm not, I don't have a huge special. I'm going to try to get a gold special on, but if I don't have a blazing hot special, or we have the phone's ringing off the hook with customers, and we're here to sell gold and silver. I talk a little bit historically about the banking system. Why do we do gold and silver? Why are we piling up yellow metal and silver metal, and holding on to it? And it's because it's a great store of value. Anything that you store that people will buy or need to use is a store of value. Corn, grain. You see those farmers. They have grain elevators. They keep that corn in there, but it does have a shelf life. It can only last so long, even if it's been dried out and ready for long-term storage. Cows, cattle ranchers, you have a lot of value in every head of cattle, but a cow dies. A cow eats every day. You have to give it something to eat, and it needs shelter. Gold and silver, and gold especially. Gold is especially made for the store of value. It can't corrode. Silver, as much as everyone, that listens to the show and likes silver, you sit there and rub a silver coin, let's say like a silver quarter or a silver dime, you sit there and rub it endlessly. At some point, there'll be no silver left. You can actually rub that into the air, like water evaporating, because, many metals can corrode or can decompose essentially into a different form. There's liquid silver and there's, powdered silver. But gold, you can change the shape of the gold. You can turn it into many forms as far as shapes and sizes and weight, but it doesn't corrode. It doesn't. You can sink the gold ship in the 1600s, and here we are in 2026. You could find that ship at the bottom of the ocean, grab the gold coins out of that ship, and they're all pristine. Nothing has happened to them. Gold has got that store of wealth. There's only so much of it for every person walking around. When the population of the world 200 or 300 years ago was less, there was less gold. Well, why is that? Well, because it takes the people to pull the gold out. Well, the people are pulling the gold out. There's going to be more of it, right? But by the time you pull more gold out, there's more people. And so is how gold works. Modern machines pulling more gold out of the ground. Well, the funny thing is about human invention, ingenuity, is as we come up with these big machines that can dig more dirt and move more ground and find more gold at a faster pace, well, the the gold coming out of the ground is coming out faster, but the people, there's more people coming up, and the population gets bigger. So gold is it's very interesting how gold has always had that $20 gold piece stayed $20 for the first 130 years of American history, and America used gold for its money. And then in 1913, the first blow to have the Federal Reserve System come in, and the bankers are going to steal, and they're really good at stealing, and gold gets in their way, so the gold is the enemy. And we're going to play some stuff on the next segment. I'm going to. It's a good listen. I'm not a big AI guy, but some of the content coming out, if it's done well, I'll play it, because it talks about Napoleon. Oh, Napoleon, the guy who wanted to conquer the world, a megalomaniac. He was in it just for himself. Well, we're going to listen to a little bit of that on the other side of the break. If you want to buy some gold from the Patriot Trading Group, it's 800-951-0592. Napoleon, the continental system. If you can remember way back in school, you learn about the continental system. Well, what was that? What was that continental system? I'm gonna play this vid. I'm gonna let the guy do the heavy lifting for me. But it was a way to stop the central banking system of the Bank of England from dominating Europe and Asia. Napoleon was an anti-banker, and you're gonna hear some stuff that's really crucial and is very truthful about what Napoleon was, more than just a brilliant tactician, but he was a money guy. He understood how to keep a country from going into debt and being ruthlessly owned by a group of bankers. And then you'll hear why Napoleon ultimately lost, what he was actually up against. And when he escaped Elba Island, he put his last shot, right? He had no chance. He had no chance, but fought all the way to the end. I do like somebody who's fighting for the people. But Jack, go ahead. Let's put this on and see the fight against the system, how it was way back in the 1800s.
Most people think they know the story of Napoleon's wars. Open any textbook, watch any documentary, and you'll hear the same version. An ambitious little Corsican general seized power, crowned himself emperor, and then decided to conquer Europe because his ego demanded it. He fought brilliant battles, won most of them, marched into Russia like a fool, and eventually lost at Waterloo because he overreached. It's a clean narrative. It's dramatic. It gets almost everything wrong about why those wars actually happened. You see, the real story of Napoleon's wars isn't about one man's ambition. It's about money. It's about banking systems. It's about trade routes and currency manipulation and the invisible architecture of financial power that was already reshaping Europe long before Napoleon ever picked up a sword. The Napoleonic Wars weren't just military campaigns. They were the violent surface expression of the deepest economic conflict of the modern era, a war between two fundamentally different visions of how wealth, trade, and power should flow across the world. And the man that historians love to cast as the instigator, Napoleon Bonaparte, was in many ways reacting to forces that had been set in motion more than a century before he was born. To understand the true origin of Napoleon's wars, you have to forget the battlefields for a moment. Forget Austerlitz. Forget Waterloo. Forget the Russian winter. Instead, follow the money. Because when you trace the financial threads, a completely different picture emerges, and it's one that most historians either ignore, downplay, or simply don't understand. Let's start, not in 1799, the year Napoleon seized power, but more than 100 years earlier, in 1688. That was the year of the so-called Glorious Revolution in England, when the Dutch Prince William of Orange crossed the English Channel, deposed King James II, and took the English throne alongside his wife Mary. Now, on the surface, this looks like a religious and political event, Protestants replacing a Catholic king. But underneath that, something far more consequential was happening. William of Orange didn't just bring Protestant rule to England, he brought the Dutch financial system. Before William arrived, England's finances were, to put it bluntly, a mess. The Crown borrowed money from goldsmiths and private lenders at extortionate rates, and there was no systematic way to fund large-scale military operations. But the Dutch had spent decades perfecting something revolutionary. They had created the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. They had pioneered public debt instruments. They had invented limited liability. They had turned capital markets into a weapon of state power. And when William took the English throne, he transplanted those ideas into the heart of British governance. Within 6 years of William's arrival, England had the Bank of England, established in 1694. This wasn't just a bank, it was a machine for turning private wealth into public war funding. The Bank of England allowed the British government to borrow at low interest rates by issuing government bonds, called consols, that investors could buy and sell freely. Suddenly, Britain had access to a virtually unlimited war chest. As long as the economy was producing, as long as investors had confidence, the government could keep borrowing and keep fighting. This was the financial innovation that would define the next 120 years of European conflict. And here's what most historians miss. From 1689 to 1815, Britain and France fought each other in what some scholars call the Second Hundred Years' War. It wasn't one conflict. It was a rolling series of wars: the 9 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolutionary War, and finally the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. When you line them up like that, a pattern emerges. These weren't separate conflicts driven by different causes. They were chapters in a single, sustained economic struggle between two empires competing for global dominance. One empire, Britain, had a financial system capable of sustaining long wars through public credit. The other empire, France, did not. That asymmetry shaped everything that followed. Now let's talk about what was happening inside France, because this is where the conventional narrative really starts to fall apart. By the late 1780s, France was bankrupt. Not metaphorically, literally bankrupt. The French government owed more money than it could ever hope to repay, and a massive portion of that debt came from a single decision: France's support of the American Revolution. Think about the irony of that for a moment. France helped the American colonies break free from Britain, not out of some philosophical commitment to liberty. It was a strategic play to weaken the British Empire. And it worked. Britain lost its American colonies, but the cost of that victory destroyed the French treasury. The French monarchy had spent roughly 1.3 billion livres supporting the American war effort, money it borrowed at crushing interest rates because France had nothing like the Bank of England to offer investors confidence in public debt. By 1789, the interest payments alone on France's national debt consumed more than half of all government revenue. Bread prices had doubled, tax collection was inefficient and deeply unfair, with the aristocracy and clergy largely exempt. The common people were starving while the court at Versailles continued to spend lavishly. When the Estates General was called in the spring of 1789, it wasn't because the French people had suddenly read too much Voltaire and decided they wanted democracy. It was because the government was out of money. The French Revolution, at its core, was a fiscal crisis that spiraled into a political one. And here is where the story takes a turn that changes everything about how we should understand Napoleon's wars. The revolution created an entirely new kind of financial chaos. The revolutionary government, desperate for cash, seized the Catholic Church's vast land holdings and used them as backing for a new paper currency called the assignat. At first, the idea seemed clever. There were about 400 million livres worth of assignats issued, backed by confiscated land. But the government couldn't resist printing more. By 1793, the total money in circulation had ballooned to nearly 3 billion francs, more than double the original amount raised from the confiscations. By 1795, the money supply had exploded to roughly 4.4 billion francs, and the francs' exchange rate against the British pound had collapsed by 45%. By the time the revolutionary government known as the Directory took power, total assignats in circulation had mushroomed to approximately 20 billion francs, and on top of that, the government had issued bonds for another 50 billion. Prices for basic goods had increased by 500 times or more compared to 1790 levels. France was drowning in hyperinflation. The assignat was essentially worthless. People were rioting for bread. The economy had imploded. And this is the world that Napoleon Bonaparte inherited when he seized power in the coup of 18 Brumaire in November of 1799. Now, here's the crucial point that most historians gloss over. Napoleon wasn't just a military genius. He was, perhaps more importantly, a financial reformer. One of the very first things he did after taking power was establish the Banque de France on the 18th of January, 1800. This wasn't a minor administrative decision. It was an attempt to rebuild the entire French financial system from the ground up. Napoleon understood something that his predecessors had failed to grasp. Political legitimacy required monetary stability. If the currency was worthless, no amount of revolutionary rhetoric or military victories could hold the nation together. The Banque de France was given the privilege of issuing banknotes, but unlike the disastrous assignats, these notes were convertible into gold and silver on demand. In 1803, Napoleon introduced the franc germinal, a new currency defined as 5 grams of silver or just over 290 milligrams of gold. This bimetallic standard would prove to be one of the most stable currencies in modern history, surviving without a single devaluation for more than a century, all the way until 1914. Napoleon's monetary system rested on 3 pillars: metallic backing that made overissuance mechanically difficult, institutional oversight through the Banque de France, and, critically, the collective memory of the assignat catastrophe, which made the French public deeply suspicious of any return to unbacked paper money. But here's the problem Napoleon couldn't solve. Even with a stabilized currency and reformed tax collection, France simply did not have the financial infrastructure to match Britain in a long war. Britain had the Bank of England, a sophisticated bond market, a deep pool of private investors willing to fund government debt, and, most importantly, the Royal Navy, which protected British trade routes and ensured that revenue kept flowing in from the colonies. France had none of these things. The French Navy had been devastated during the Revolution, and France's overseas colonies had been largely cut off or captured by the British. This is the fundamental asymmetry that drove everything Napoleon did, and it's the one thing that most historians fail to emphasize. Napoleon's military campaigns were not acts of pure aggression. They were attempts to solve an economic problem that he could not solve through finance alone. Britain could afford to fight indefinitely because it could borrow indefinitely. France could not. So Napoleon had to find other ways to fund his wars, and more crucially, other ways to weaken Britain. And this brings us to the event that truly triggered the escalation of the Napoleonic Wars into a continent-wide catastrophe. It wasn't a battle. It wasn't an invasion. It was an economic blockade. On the 16th of May, 1806, the British Royal Navy imposed a full naval blockade of the French coast and all French allied ports. This was an act of economic warfare, pure and simple. Britain was using its naval supremacy to strangle French trade, cut off French access to raw materials and colonial goods, and squeeze the French economy until it collapsed. Historians often frame this as a defensive measure, Britain protecting itself from the aggressive Napoleon. But look at the timeline. Britain struck first. The blockade came before Napoleon's continental system, not after it. Napoleon's response, the Berlin Decree of November 21st, 1806, was a retaliation. He declared that all British Isles were in a state of blockade and forbade France or any of its allies from importing British goods into Europe. He followed this with the Milan Decree of December 1807, which ordered the seizure of any vessel trading with or sailing from any British port, even if the vessel belonged to a neutral country. Together, these decrees formed what we know as the Continental System, Napoleon's attempt to turn economic warfare back against Britain. Now, conventional historians treat the Continental System as evidence of Napoleon's overreach, his irrational desire to control all of Europe. But that completely misreads the situation. Scholar Alexander Mikaberidze has argued persuasively that Napoleon's Continental System was not as irrational as some have claimed, but was rather a continuation of traditional policies of economic warfare that had been going on between Britain and France for over a century. Since the late 1600s, both nations had repeatedly used tariffs, blockades, and trade restrictions to undermine each other's economies. Napoleon was simply escalating a long-established pattern. And consider the logic from Napoleon's perspective. After the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805, where British Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the combined Franco-Spanish fleet, Napoleon knew that a direct military invasion of Britain was impossible. He couldn't defeat the Royal Navy. He couldn't cross the English Channel. The only weapon he had left was economic. If he could cut Britain off from European markets, he believed, the British economy would collapse under the weight of overproduction. Factories would close, unemployment would skyrocket, gold reserves would drain, and eventually the British government would be forced to sue for peace. It wasn't a crazy idea. In fact, it nearly worked. By 1810, British exports had dropped dramatically. Gold reserves were falling. The manufacturing heartland of England was experiencing genuine economic distress. The Continental System did strain the British economy, driving down exports and gold reserves significantly. In 1811, British exports fell to roughly £44 million, a severe decline. The crisis of 1811 was a real and dangerous moment for the British economy, exacerbated by poor harvests in 1809 and 1810
there,
that
Jack.
drove up.
We're going to do a little more in the next segment. Yeah, it was working. It was working, and what the narrators didn't, because he's not, this is about Napoleon, this is about the French and the European situation with the banks. But 1811 is also when the British, as the Continental System was starting to hurt them really badly, this is when they started the War of 1812. the United States government, by one vote, was able to eliminate the central bank, the second bank, or the first bank in the United States in 1811 by one vote. So it was working. People did not like the Bank of England. They were trying to get rid of central banks. And when we come back, we're going to play more of what Napoleon was, doing, and the battles that he won. The interesting thing about Napoleon, he didn't lose very much. He won battle after battle after battle after battle. And if he keeps winning the battles, here's the whole thing with people. We got this little war in Iran going on, right? There's these wars that just seem to never end. Napoleon just keeps winning battle after battle after battle after battle. Then, well, wait a minute. How come it ended up not going so well? So we'll answer that on the other side. Napoleon, he wasn't trying to conquer the planet. He wasn't. He was trying to give freedom to the people. But history is written by the winners. So, well, what happened? How did why didn't Napoleon succeed? Let's continue on, Jack. Let's listen to a little more.
But here's where the story gets interesting, and where the role of private finance becomes impossible to ignore. Britain didn't just survive Napoleon's economic warfare through government policy alone. It survived because of its financial system, and specifically because of the private bankers who kept that system running. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British government formed and underwrote 7 coalitions against France. The total cost to Britain came to roughly £1.6 billion. Britain's national debt tripled during this period, ballooning from around £290 million to approximately $860 million. Of that, British subsidies paid directly to Allied nations. Russia, Austria, Prussia, Portugal, Sweden, and others totaled more than £65 million. But the subsidies weren't just cash transfers. They included staggering amounts of war supplies, weapons, uniforms, equipment, all mass-produced by British factories and shipped to allies across Europe. Britain was paying other countries to fight Napoleon. Let that sink in for a moment. Russia alone received £1.25 million in golden guineas for every 100,000 men it fielded against France. By 1814, the British war budget had reached £66 million in a single year, with $10 million going to the Navy, $40 million to the Army, and $10 million directly to Allied powers. This was industrial-scale war financing, and no other nation on earth could match it. And at the center of this financial machinery sat a family that would become one of the most powerful in history, the Rothschilds. Nathan Mayer Rothschild, the London-based member of the 5 Rothschild brothers, had established himself as a critical intermediary between the British government and the money markets. When the Duke of Wellington needed funds to sustain his campaign against Napoleon in the Iberian Peninsula, the British government turned to Rothschild.
Pause it there for a second, Jack. Just to add a little bit, if you were listening to this, what England did to confront their Napoleon problem was just to borrow and borrow and borrow, and then they gave the money to other countries to fight their enemy. Now, they were fighting Napoleon as well, but they got everybody else. And how did they get everyone else to do it? They gave them money, did business with them, manufactured for them. And isn't it interesting now how you have America, since World War II ended, fighting all the wars? Who is the majority owner of the Federal Reserve Bank? Between 52 to 57% is usually the balance. It's the Rothschilds, who owned the Bank of England, who ran the country of England during this period that we're talking about. Seems like there's somebody else fighting their wars to this day. This is why a lot of people that say, hey, it's all the Bank of England, England's still in charge, the crown, all that stuff. That's because the Rothschilds bought the country of England, and it's been sort of their strong point. They have New York, London, and Paris. Those are those, and the Vatican are their strong points of ruling the planet. But anyways, we wanted to throw it out there. Hey, it's interesting listening to how England was paying other people to fight their war against Napoleon, and they just did it by borrowing money in their centrally banked system on the backs of everybody that had to produce for them. Jack, go ahead.
Wellington needed roughly £100,000 every month by August of 1812, a sum with the purchasing power of more than £5 million today. The Rothschild brothers set up a network of agents across Europe who could buy up gold and silver coins from multiple countries and transfer them to Wellington in the form of local currency. Their operation was so efficient that by January of 1814, the British Commissary-in-Chief gave Nathan Rothschild formal authority to act as a government agent to collect funds across Germany, France, and Holland. The Rothschilds earned a 2% commission on these transfers, but that barely begins to capture the scale of their involvement. They weren't just moving money. They were financing multiple sides of the conflict simultaneously. While Nathan funded the British war effort in London, his brother Jacob, based in Paris, maintained financial relationships with the French side. The Rothschilds' position of neutrality, their ability to operate across borders and across battle lines, gave them a unique and incredibly profitable position. Regardless of who won any given battle, the Rothschilds made money. And then came Waterloo. The legend goes that Nathan Rothschild learned of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo a full 24 hours before the British government, thanks to his private network of couriers who used coded messages and carrier pigeons. Whether every detail of the famous Waterloo story is accurate has been debated by historians, but what is not disputed is that Rothschild had built a communication network faster than anything any government possessed. He had access to information before anyone else, and he used that information to trade on the London bond market. When the official news of Napoleon's defeat finally reached London and British government bonds soared in value, Rothschild was positioned to reap enormous profits. By 1820, the Rothschilds were the most powerful banking family in Europe, their credit network essential to any major government financial operation. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not suggesting that the Rothschilds caused Napoleon's wars or that they were pulling strings behind the scenes like puppet masters. That would be a simplistic and conspiratorial reading of history. What I am saying is that the financial infrastructure that enabled Britain to fight Napoleon for 22 consecutive years, to fund 7 separate coalitions, to subsidize armies across the entire European continent, that infrastructure was not a minor detail of the war. It was the war. Without British finance, the coalitions against Napoleon would have collapsed. Russia couldn't have fielded its armies. Austria couldn't have rebuilt after its defeats. Prussia couldn't have armed its soldiers. Britain's money was the glue that held the anti-Napoleon alliance together, and private bankers like the Rothschilds were the ones who made that money flow. Napoleon himself understood this perfectly. He called the British subsidies to his enemies by a contemptuous name. He referred to them as the Golden Cavalry of St. George, the idea being that British gold coins stamped with St. George were doing more damage to France than any cavalry charge ever could. And he was right. Napoleon won battle after battle, campaign after campaign, and yet he could never deliver the knockout blow because every time he defeated one coalition, Britain simply opened its checkbook and funded another one. This is the real tragedy of Napoleon's position, and it's the thing that most military historians completely fail to grasp. Napoleon's wars weren't ultimately about territory or ego. They were about a man trying to break a financial system that he could not compete with. Every major military decision Napoleon made in the later years of his reign can be traced back to this fundamental economic problem. Consider the Peninsular War, which began in 1807. Why did Napoleon invade Spain and Portugal? The standard explanation is that it was about enforcing the continental system, since Portugal refused to comply with the trade ban on British goods. And that's true. But go one level deeper. Why was Portugal trading with Britain? Because Portugal's economy depended on it. Portugal's Atlantic trade routes were intertwined with British commerce. Cutting off trade with Britain would have devastated the Portuguese economy, so Portugal refused. Napoleon invaded to enforce his economic blockade, and the result was a 6-year quagmire that killed over 200,000 French soldiers and drained French resources at a time when Napoleon could least afford it. Or consider the invasion of Russia in 1812, the catastrophe that ultimately destroyed Napoleon's empire. Again, the standard explanation focuses on Napoleon's ego, his desire to punish Tsar Alexander for defying him. But the real cause was, once again, economic. Russia had joined the continental system after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. But the economic pain of complying was severe. Between 1807 and 1812, the continental system led to a roughly 1,300% increase in Russian national debt, a 50% drop in the value of the Russian paper currency, and a 40% decline in exports. Russian nobles were losing fortunes. The ruble was collapsing.
All right, welcome back. The Patriot Radio News Hour, gold and silver, 800-951-0592 to buy gold and silver. Gold and silver, it's your rock, that's your safety, it's your savings. It's you got to have it as a part of your financial future. So let's continue on. I'm not even going to get the whole thing in. Let's do more of this Napoleon bit and what happened during the Napoleonic Wars. Jack.
By December of 1810, Tsar Alexander reopened Russian ports to neutral shipping, which was a thinly veiled restoration of trade with Britain. Napoleon's choice was stark. Either accept Russia's defection from the continental system, which would effectively destroy his entire economic strategy against Britain, or invade Russia and force compliance. He chose invasion. not because he was a megalomaniac who couldn't resist conquest, but because his entire strategy for defeating Britain depended on keeping Russia in the economic blockade. It was a desperate gamble born of financial desperation, not battlefield ambition, and we know how that gamble ended. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, roughly 600,000 men, and marched them into Russia in June of 1812. The Russians, rather than meeting him in a decisive battle, retreated, burning everything behind them in a scorched earth campaign that left Napoleon's army with nothing to eat, no shelter, and no way to sustain itself across the vast Russian landscape. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée stumbled back across the border in December, fewer than 100,000 men remained in fighting condition. The rest were dead, mostly from disease, starvation, and the brutal Russian winter, more than 500,000 casualties. It was the greatest military disaster in European history up to that point, and it was caused not by Napoleon's arrogance, but by the impossible economics of trying to fight a financial superpower without a financial system of your own. Now, there's another dimension to this story that rarely gets discussed, and it has to do with what Napoleon was actually trying to build. Because if you look beyond the battles and the blockades, Napoleon was attempting something genuinely revolutionary in the economic sphere. He wasn't just trying to destroy British trade, he was trying to create an alternative European economic system. The Banque de France wasn't just for France. Napoleon established similar financial institutions in the territories he controlled. He introduced the Napoleonic Code, which standardized commercial law across much of Europe, making contracts more enforceable and property rights more secure. He built roads, bridges, and canals that connected previously isolated markets. He modernized tax collection. He introduced the metric system for weights and measures, which made cross-border trade far more efficient. In a very real sense, Napoleon was trying to build something like a European common market more than a century before the European Economic Community was established. He wanted a continental economy that was integrated enough to rival Britain's global trading empire. If he could create a self-sufficient European economy that didn't need British goods or British capital, then Britain's financial superpower status would become irrelevant. This is why the continental system, despite its obvious failures, wasn't as irrational as it's often portrayed. Napoleon wasn't just blocking British imports for spite. He was trying to force-grow European manufacturing to fill the gap left by British goods. And in some places, it actually worked. French cotton manufacturing expanded significantly during the period of the continental system, precisely because British competition had been eliminated. The problem was that the system also devastated French Atlantic ports like Nantes and Bordeaux, whose economies depended on overseas trade. It hurt France's own allies, who needed colonial raw materials that only Britain could supply. And it shifted the axis of European trade decisively inland, away from the coastal economies that had traditionally been the richest. The continental system was, in effect, the world's first comprehensive experiment in economic warfare, and its most definitive failure. But its failure wasn't because the idea was inherently stupid. It failed because Napoleon couldn't enforce it without a navy, and because the human cost of enforcement, the invasions of Portugal, Spain, the Papal States, and ultimately Russia, made the cure worse than the disease. And this brings us to the deepest irony of Napoleon's story, the one that historians almost never discuss. Napoleon lost not because he was defeated on the battlefield. He lost because he was playing a game that had been rigged against him from the start. Britain had spent more than a century building a financial system specifically designed to sustain long wars. The Bank of England, the bond market, the network of private bankers, the income tax introduced in 1799 specifically to fund the war against France, all of these instruments gave Britain a structural advantage that no amount of military genius could overcome. France, by contrast, had entered the modern era with a financial system that was medieval by comparison. The French monarchy had defaulted on its debts at least 3 times before 1780. The Revolution had destroyed what little financial infrastructure existed, and even Napoleon's reforms, impressive as they were, couldn't close the gap in time. The Banque de France was established in 1800, but the Bank of England had been operating since 1694, more than a century of head start in building investor confidence and institutional expertise. Napoleon's war funding model was fundamentally different from Britain's, and fundamentally weaker. While Britain borrowed from its own citizens through bond markets, Napoleon relied primarily on taxation and, crucially, on plunder. The French army funded itself through requisitions from conquered territories. After each victory, Napoleon would impose massive war indemnities on the defeated nation, strip its treasuries, and use that money to fund the next campaign. This worked as long as France was winning. But the moment the victories stopped, the money stopped too. Unlike Britain, France couldn't borrow its way through a losing streak. The economic writing was on the wall. Napoleon's France could not win a long war, no matter how many battles he won. The retreat from Russia signaled the end because it revealed once and for all that the conquest and plunder model had reached its limits. There were no more wealthy nations left to conquer and strip. And here is where the story comes full circle, back to the broader question of what historians get wrong. The conventional narrative of Napoleon's wars focuses on battles, on generals, on strategy and tactics. It treats the wars as primarily military events driven by the ambitions of a single extraordinary individual. But when you examine the financial underpinnings, a completely different picture emerges. Napoleon's wars were the final act of a century-long struggle between two economic systems. On one side, you had the British model, built on public credit, private banking, naval supremacy, and global trade. This was a system that could sustain wars indefinitely because it could always find new sources of capital. On the other side, you had the French model, which, despite Napoleon's reforms, was still fundamentally based on land taxation, military conquest, and territorial control. This was a system that could produce brilliant short-term victories but could not sustain a prolonged conflict against a financially superior enemy. The coalitions that defeated Napoleon weren't held together by shared ideology or common fear. They were held together by British money. Every single coalition against Napoleon was funded primarily by Britain. When Austria was defeated, British gold helped it rebuild. When Prussia was crushed, British subsidies helped it rearm. When Russia was exhausted, British payments kept its armies in the field. Without this constant flow of financial support, the coalitions would have disintegrated after every French victory, and Napoleon might well have achieved the lasting peace he claimed to want. This is also why Napoleon's final attempt at a comeback, 100 Days in 1815, was doomed from the start.
800-951-0592, your gold and silver number. Call it, and we will help you out with those precious metals needs. Let's finish this thing up. I got a few more minutes here. I got almost to the end, but I think you got you understand that history a little better. You know, you have to dig a little deeper to get the full truth of it. And well, yeah, he was battling against the most ferocious banking system ever, and he just couldn't get it done. And well, let's finish off. It talks about how he escapes Elba Island and makes one more shot at it, but he really didn't have a chance. But go ahead, Jack. Let's play this.
And Napoleon might well have achieved the lasting peace he claimed to want. This is also why Napoleon's final attempt at a comeback, 100 Days in 1815, was doomed from the start. By that point, Napoleon had no economic base left. France was exhausted. The treasury was empty. When he returned from exile on Elba, Napoleon had to rely on massive emergency borrowing just to put an army in the field. His gambit at Waterloo was made possible only by a huge mobilization of popular support and frantic financial borrowing. Even if he had won the battle, there was no economic foundation to sustain a renewed empire. The financial superstructure that might have supported his ambitions had never existed in the first place. Now, I want to address one more thing that historians consistently get wrong about Napoleon's wars, and that's the question of who actually benefited. The standard narrative says that Napoleon was the aggressor and Britain was the defender of European liberty. But look at what happened after Waterloo. The Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815 restored the old monarchies to power across Europe. The democratic and legal reforms that Napoleon had introduced, the Napoleonic Code, the abolition of feudal privileges, the modernization of civil law, many of these were rolled back by the restored kings and emperors. The people of Europe, who had briefly tasted legal equality and administrative efficiency under Napoleonic rule, were shoved back under the same aristocratic systems that had oppressed them for centuries. And who profited the most from Napoleon's defeat? The answer is clear. The British Empire entered the post-Napoleonic era as the undisputed global superpower. British trade dominated every ocean. The City of London became the financial capital of the world. The Rothschilds and their fellow banking dynasties became the de facto controllers of European sovereign finance. The Concert of Europe, the security system established after Napoleon's defeat, was essentially a British-designed framework for maintaining the status quo and preventing any future challenger from disrupting the global order that enriched Britain so enormously. The national debt that Britain accumulated during the Napoleonic Wars, all 860 million pounds of it, became the engine of post-war economic development. As bond prices rose after 1813, the so-called wealth effect pumped enormous amounts of capital into the British economy. Investors who had bought war bonds at deep discounts now saw their portfolios surge in value. That wealth funded the final takeoff of the Industrial Revolution. The very war that nearly bankrupted Britain ended up making it richer and more powerful than ever. In other words, the Napoleonic Wars weren't just a military conflict that Britain happened to win. They were a mechanism through which a specific financial system, the British model of public credit and private banking, achieved permanent global dominance. And that dominance persisted well into the 20th century, until it was gradually replaced by the American system, which was itself directly descended from the British model, having been built on the same Dutch financial innovations that William of Orange had carried across the English Channel in 1688. So what do historians actually get wrong about Napoleon's wars? Almost everything that matters. They get the causes wrong by focusing on Napoleon's ambition rather than the structural economic conflict between Britain and France that had been escalating for over a century. They get the nature of the conflict wrong by treating it as a series of military campaigns rather than an economic war.
All right, there you go, guys. That's pretty much the end of it. Patriot Radio News Hour. Hey, I will be back tomorrow. Bye.